Hi again. So, I'm going to see if you can recognize this. Something my colleagues told me when I first started at Ticketmaster was that I was going through the source code and I was looking everything through and I was going, what the fuck were they thinking? This is so dumb. Like, this should go there and this should be doing that, and why is this so messy? And so my colleague, he said to me, "Oh, I'm late for." Or he used the term code mocking. He said, "Oh, the code mocking has started." And at first, I didn't like. I asked him at lunch, like, "What do you mean about like what do you mean with code mocking?" And he said, "Well, whenever there's a new person who joins your team, or whenever somebody is like start looking at the code base for the very first time, sooner or later you're going to hear them complain about the state of the code, for the most part." And that's what he called the code mocking. And I asked him about it, and he said that, well, the thing is that whenever code is written for the first time, most of the time, like, the person writing that code at that point in time is for the most part doing the best they can with the information that is provided. And then somebody else comes, like, you add another feature or another feature without actually thinking so much about that piece of code over there. So that's usually what happens. If you see that, you will see that over time things grow more and more complex, and without actually being because you're not conscious about every single piece of code that is in your project at any given time. And because you're not conscious about it, you will inadvertently sooner or later create something that, from if you look from at that from another angle, it will seem as if it's incompetence that has led up to this point. And at first I didn't it was hard for me to grasp, but then I started looking at the commit history of these different files, and I could see that the pieces of code that was like where it was so obvious that, oh, if this piece of code here and that piece of code there, they're doing very similar things. We could refactor that and make it much nicer, a better experience. And then I actually looked at the history and I saw that these two pieces of code had almost 2 years difference between them. And if you and completely different people who had written these pieces of code. And that's where it kind of dawned on me that, here I am even a few years later looking at both these two pieces of information, or these code snippets, side by side. And that's a completely different perspective than what the first person who wrote the first line of the first code had. It's also a different perspective than what the second person who wrote a completely different feature. It was a completely different thing. They didn't necessarily know about the first piece of code that had been written, which is very common, when you're more than one person writing, even if you're a single person. I mean, if your project grows and it goes on for long enough, I mean, shit, my own startup, I'm finding code all the time where I kind of go, why didn't I do this instead? Because you're continuously learning. You're faced with different perspectives, and since you can't keep everything in your head, it's only really during in a specific situation where you, as I said, where you put things next to each other for whatever reason, where you actually see that, hey, you can make this nicer. So the point my colleague's point was virtually that, everybody does this. And I kind of, I sucked on that for a while and thought about it, and I came to the realization that if you think about it, it's not fair to judge a piece of code harshly from that perspective, because when you're looking at it from my perspective, as I said, when I have things next to each other, that's a completely different context than what was in what the situation was for the people who originally wrote it. And this might seem to be such a simple and obvious thing, but I'm pretty sure that if you've been doing software development, you have at some point criticized somebody else's code or thought, oh, this is really bad. And if you do yourself that favor to try and think about, when was this written? What was the motivation behind it? Because if, like, sure enough, there are absolutely situations where the code is just plain bad, but I try to think about the reason why it is that way. Even my favorite example of this type of situation is when you come to a piece of code where you have a function that is several hundred lines long. And you can see that over time, like, there's several people who have been working on this over time, and it's just grown. It's grown and grown and grown and grown. And what I argue when this happens is that this is not incompetence. It's basically, it's either fear of breaking something or an undesire to fix something that is spiraling out of control. I call it shim programming. Instead of fixing a potential issue, which is this growing function that is doing too much, you shim in your own features because you have a deadline, or you don't have, like, your contract, like, for any reason, you're just not taking care of the mess. It's like not cleaning your dishes after you've had your food. For some, like, you should. There's no really good valid reason for the most part, but you don't. And it's the same principle. Or if you forget to brush your teeth, whatever, it's just basic good hygiene, but you don't. And that I started thinking more and more about this, and I actually caught myself just the other day making this, and this is where it kind of dawned on me. I mean, even in where I'm the only person writing code here, I'm the only person. I found in my own project that I realized that, hey, I could do something that I do a lot of. I have a lot of boilerplate for a certain thing, and I could optimize that just a little bit and make it a nicer experience. And then I looked back at the stuff that I wrote 6 months ago, and I realized, like, why didn't I think about that when I was? It's so obvious to me now. Why didn't I write it? Write it right from the beginning. And then I remember, well, 6 months ago, I was still trying to figure out how to solve this type of problem, like a completely different problem. My mindset was not to optimize this thing that I'm thinking about right now. It was in a completely different world. I was thinking about something very different from what I was thinking at this moment, and that's a very natural thing. So that's why refactoring and these things, like, some people, non-technical people, don't understand why this happens. And this plain and simple truth is that as time moves on, you find better and better ways of doing things. And the real trick, in my opinion, is to find a sane way of approaching, continuously improving your code, like the Boy Scout rule or whatever, to find a safe way of doing that without creating regressions. And to know when it's a good time to make that refactor or make that improvement, and when it's a better idea to just let the code be, and that type of thing. And my rule of thumb is that, or rather, the Boy Scout rule is probably the best thing to apply here. If you're fixing it, if you're working with it, then make a small improvement, because trust me, I used to be that way. I used to think that, okay, I found a better way to do this thing, and I'm doing this in 100 different places. I need to go back and refactor everything so the code is as good as is humanly possible. And I realized that doesn't actually provide much value to the project. It really only makes me mentally satisfied, and which is great, but I have to, you have to think about, is that mental troll that is telling you to make this perfect, make it poetry, make it, sensualist, like make it beautiful, make the code beautiful. That troll that is telling you to do this, really ask yourself, are you trying to do this because the code is bad? Or is it because it's just not written in that exact way that you now know you should have written it to start off with?